So, more time has passed since our last video on this subject than I'd have liked, but you know, life. For those of you that did follow us on the path of finding the perfect method for making proxies and or originals for your card games, you'll hopefully appreciate this not just about finding the best end product, but achieving it with the least time investment possible. There's nothing quite like the huge ball ache of a job taking way too long to be worth the effort. And so, whilst this video won't serve as a detailed step-by-step guide to making proxies, I promise that's up next, it's a guide to the ways we've learnt to speed up our current process. Data-driven graphics, or more specifically image variables, is a technique I've been using in Photoshop to allow me to automatically place all the cards on our template, where they need to go for printing. Manually placing each one is cumbersome at best, and although there are different ways to go about automating this process, this is the one I've found that's most layman friendly. So, in a nutshell, this approach is going to enable you to input the file images you need into a spreadsheet, press a few buttons, and voila, you've got a page ready to print. Of course, it's not quite that straightforward, and so it's going to take a bit of how-to explaining. First off, we need to prep our page in Photoshop. Don't panic though, we've got you covered with a link to a template I've created in the description. But if you want to give it a go yourself, you can create your own rectangles using the appropriate tool, and you'll see here I've then filled each rectangle with a colour to help visualise the information on screen. Placing the centre one first and then orienting each precisely around it. You can then choose to provide yourself with guidelines to help with the cutting process or not. That's up to you. The point of this preparation is that we're then going to use variables to replace the rectangle layer with our own image, which is why it's important you set each rectangle's dimensions to 744 pixels in width and 1039 in height. That's the closest you can get, assuming your canvas is using the default for print media of 300 pixels per inch, to a traditional Magic the Gathering style card size of 63 by 88 millimeters, or 2.48 by 3.465 inches. You may recall that I used a template that separated each card with a space before. That was to allow for full bleed images or those whose borders weren't uniform. I've since been printing a lot more cards that can afford to be printed side by side, and so I've created a new template for that as well, with the obvious benefit of needing less cuts on the guillotine when it comes to that part of the process. Now, back to the sort of complicated part, defining our variables. Here is how we tell Photoshop what shapes we want to replace with our chosen images. You'll need to go to Variables in the Image drop-down menu and then click Define. At this point you then need to find your rectangle layers. As you can see, I've named mine card 1 through card 9 in order as shown left to right, top to bottom on the page. For each layer you then need to tick the pixel replacement button and name it the same as the layer. This is the header that Photoshop will look for in the file we're going to create in the next step of this process. In this window you've also got different methods you can use in the drop down menu, and a lot will depend on your source files. As I've explained, I prepare my images so they're always in the same ratio as the 744 by 1039 pixels we talked about earlier, and so the fit method will work just fine here. But if you're concerned about the source picture being letterboxed on the top or the side, then you can just as easily use the fill option and then tick the clip to bounding box to ensure the image doesn't overspill. Finally, if you're dealing with full bleed source pictures, then the as is button will work best, as it will spill the bleed off the edges of your rectangle equally on all sides. Repeat that process then for all of your card layers and we're good to proceed. Once you're done with your template, we then need to prepare our images. Now, whether you've imported these from a PDF or however you've obtained them, you need to do some data cleansing to ensure you know what file represents what card when you're looking at a bunch of files on your computer. If all your files already have a naming convention that can allow you to distinguish what each is without a great deal of cross-referencing, then you can probably skip this part. If not, you need to either manually change all your file names or use something like a bulk renaming utility to get the job done. And whether I'm printing proxies or creations of my own, I try to keep the file name short and sweet. usually the set number followed by the card number in the set. Yes, you can add the card name in there as well, but I don't usually find that's particularly helpful. But ultimately you'll want to find the way that works best for you. Once that's done, you then need to go to the folder in your computer where the files are stored, highlight all the files and right click on them. Sometimes you have to hold down the shift key before you do so, and then you can click on copy as path. Then open up your Excel or equivalent spreadsheet and paste into your document. You'll see then the full path to your file in each cell from top to bottom. Now you need to set up your headers so that Photoshop can reference where it's supposed to place what. This is the header name for your variable, which if you're using my template I've named cards 1 through card 9, representing the rectangle layers from left to right and top to bottom on the page. Then you just need to plug in the file names you want to display. So if you just need the one copy, great, but if you need multiples to make up a playset, then you just repeat the file name as many times as you need. One thing to be wary of when doing this, you must fill every cell up on each row, otherwise the file will not import. Understand as well you can rinse and repeat this process for multiple pages, just add the next batch of file names you want on the next row. Final stop here then is to save the file as a text tab delimited file, although I think CSV works just as fine as well. And then we're back to Photoshop for the good part. Now you need to navigate yourself back to image and then variables, but this time you want to click on datasets and then import. Find your file, then either tick the preview box to see what it looks like without leaving the window, or click apply to make the changes, and finally the OK button to see in glorious full screen your time-saving endeavours. If you did happen to have more than one row of data for multiple pages, then all you need to do is scroll through the left and right arrows in the dataset window to toggle through them. And so that there was a whistle-stop tour of the process that has caused me the most gains in time since my last video. Obviously if you just need a handful of cards printed, then there's no real gains to be found doing it this way, but for sure if you're dealing in bulk, this is going to cost you a small amount of time up front, but gain you back a bunch of your life in the long run. As I already mentioned, the template I used to use also had gaps between each card, but because I've been dealing with a lot of cards with a monocoloured border, I don't need to worry as much about wonky cutting on my part. And so having cards with no gaps in between them on the template drastically reduced the number of guillotine cuts on each page from 20 down to 12. Yes, that's right, we're really trying to min-max this whole affair. Obviously if you've got full art bordered cards or anything that won't necessarily work when abutted with another image, then you can still use the old template. And if you're using full bleed source images, you should just define your variables to as is, to allow the image to, bleed, as opposed to filling or fitting the image as we talked about earlier. The last remaining gain we've incorporated was the most expensive, and it was to upscale to an A3 printer. I was able to find all the same equipment at that larger size, including the paper, the laminating sheets, the laminator, etc. Although admittedly there is slightly less in the way of choice when it comes to paper, but that's to be expected. This approach that will see you printing 18 cards as opposed to 9 on each page will get you marginal gains in each step, including print time, lamination time, and the number of cuts with the paper cutter. So it's by no means essential, but again, if you're dealing with bulk, you'll probably be grateful for it in the end. So other than practice and repetition, these have been the two big time-saving games I've incorporated into the process so far. I hope you found them helpful. I'll get to work on that much anticipated step-by-step guide toot sweet. Alas, I've been the voice of Benji, and this video has ended.